Bầu Village lay nestled beneath the white sand dunes of Quang Nam province. But unlike the scorching, skin-burning sun of central Vietnam, the air here always carried an unpleasant dampness from the marshlands to the east. In the early 90s, life for the villagers was still harsh, marked by nightly fishing trips when the first fish began to splash on the water's surface. The vast Bầu Pond was as still as a mirror, yet its depths were unfathomable. Its surface was overgrown with reeds taller than a person. That night, Leo, a skilled fisherman, navigated his small boat through the reeds, a flickering lantern illuminating the water, creating shimmering streaks like restless snakes. He discreetly lit a cigarette, then plunged his oar into the water, careful not to startle the fish. Leo planned to fish in the area behind the ancestor shrine, a place the villagers whispered had many large fish but also countless strange tales. As his boat ventured deeper into the reeds, a thick, milky fog began to spread across the water. The silence was so profound Leo could hear his own breath. He stopped rowing and cast his first net. Suddenly, from a distance, a faint cry echoed, like a woman calling out someone's name in the dead of night. Leo froze, his hands gripping the oar. The call was indistinct, carried by the wind rustling through the reeds. He tried to convince himself it was just a night bird or the sound of the wind playing tricks in the distant rocks. But then, the boat suddenly shook violently, as if something massive had slammed hard against its side. Leo clutched the boat's rim, his eyes fixed on the black water. In the faint moonlight, he saw a long, shadowy figure dart past quickly. "Is that Old Man Bay?" Leo called out loudly, but only the wind answered. He quickly began to pull in his net, eager to return. His heart pounded with an uneasy premonition. Yet the net seemed to be snagged on something extremely heavy. He used all his strength to pull it up, but the harder he pulled, the more the boat was dragged toward the center of the pond. In an instant, a pale, bony arm reached up from the water, grabbing tightly onto the side of the boat. Leo tried to scream, but the sight of the arm paralyzed him completely. 6 days later, with the sun high in the sky, Bầu Village was shrouded in bewilderment. Early fishermen had discovered Leo's boat drifting alone in the middle of the pond. Inside the boat, the net lay half-pulled, a half-smoked cigarette rolling around on the wooden floor, but Leo himself was nowhere to be found. The entire village flocked to the shore, worried whispers filling the air. As the crowd murmured, a middle-aged man walked with a slight limp towards the water. He wore faded black traditional clothes, carried a cloth bag, and leaned on an old, gnarled wooden staff. This was Old Man Thieu. He wasn't originally from Bầu Village but had settled here over a decade ago and was known for his profound knowledge of yin-yang and numerology. Old Man Thieu stopped at the edge of the pond, his eyes narrowing as he gazed at the distant reed bed. He said nothing, simply observing the ripples on the water. "Uncle Thieu, do you think Leo will be found?" A villager asked, his voice trembling before he could even finish his sentence. Old Man Thieu nodded faintly, his voice deep and solemn. "Leave him be for now. No one should go into the water. This pond is thirsty. It wants to claim more lives." Old Man Thieu's words sent a chill down everyone's spines. He offered no further explanation, just stood there, staring intently at the dark pond, as if conversing with an invisible entity. 3 agonizing days passed since Leo's disappearance. Bầu Village was steeped in an eerie silence, fear so thick that no one dared approach the pond at night. The villagers searched the entire area around Leo's boat with long poles, but found no trace. Then, on the morning of the 4th day, a putrid, foul stench began to spread with the wind from the ancient banyan tree at the edge of the village, bordering the marshland. This banyan tree was hundreds of years old, its roots trailing down to the water's surface. When the first villagers passed by, they discovered a terrifying sight unlike any they had ever seen. Leo's body was not in the water as expected, but sprawled precariously high in the banyan tree, taller than any man. His body was bruised purple, his skin swollen, and his eyes wide open. Strangely, his clothes were completely dry, as if he had never fallen into the water. News quickly spread throughout Bầu Village, drawing everyone to the banyan tree. When Old Man Thieu arrived, he looked up at the body, his eyebrows furrowed. He instructed the young men to bring Leo down. As the body was laid on the ground, everyone instinctively recoiled. Leo's neck bore deep, dark bruises that weren't ordinary contusions. They looked as if his flesh had been severely frozen, leading to necrosis. "Uncle Thieu, Leo was found in the tree, but his boat was on the pond?" Engia, one of Leo's friends, asked with a shaky voice. Old Man Thieu didn't answer immediately. He bent down, using a dry leaf to gently touch the black marks on the victim's neck. The leaf instantly turned dark gray, then crumbled to ash. He wasn't drowned. He was dragged away. Old Man Thieu muttered gravely, his voice filled with warning. He then examined Leo's hands. Underneath his fingernails were clumps of dry reeds and a foul-smelling black mud, unlike any mud found in this pond. People began to whisper about vengeful spirits in the night. Old Man Thieu urged the villagers to take Leo's body for burial immediately. He stood silently beneath the banyan tree for a long time, his hand resting on his gnarled wooden staff. At the base of the tree, he noticed deep claw marks in the wood. It was as if someone had desperately tried to cling on before being pulled high up. The sunlight began to fade, casting long, sprawling shadows across the ground. Old Man Thieu felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. He turned around, but there was no one there, only the rustling banyan leaves in the wind. He knew that Leo's death was just the beginning of a blood debt long forgotten beneath the Bầu Pond. After Leo's bizarre death, Bầu Village was no longer peaceful. Strange sounds began to appear at night, and the most terrifying sign was the arrival of black crows. The village usually had very few crows, but since Leo's burial, hundreds of them flew in, perching on ancient trees and the ancestor shrine. Their cawing echoed throughout the village. They didn't fly off in search of food, but stayed eerily still. The elderly villagers grew worried, saying that the crows' arrival was an omen of impending disaster. Old woman Tam, nearly 90 years old, living in a small thatched house near the ancestor shrine, began exhibiting strange behaviors. She frequently stayed awake all night, pacing back and forth, muttering incomprehensible words. Her daughter Tam was extremely worried and didn't know what to do. One night, old woman Tam suddenly sprang up, stumbled into the middle of the village yard, and wailed desperately, "Give them back their lives. The blood in the pond is boiling. You can't escape." Her shriek tore through the silent night of Bầu Village. Everyone rushed out to see old woman Tam kneeling, clawing at the earth until her hands bled. She kept repeating about a blood debt from generations past, about a woman whose body was buried deep in the mud. When Old Man Thieu rushed over, old woman Tam looked at him with pleading eyes, then collapsed. Old Man Thieu told Tam to carry her mother inside. He stood in the yard, looking up at the ancestor shrine roof where the crows perched. They showed no fear of people, even cawing defiantly as if challenging him. Old Man Thieu realized that a powerful negative energy enveloped the ancestor shrine. Old Man Thieu decided to prepare a special offering. He instructed Tam to buy some salt, white wine, and prepared a black rooster. But he didn't bring these things into the shrine to pray as people usually would. Instead, he took them to the pond's edge just as dusk settled. Old Man Thieu placed the offering on a flat stone, pouring wine into 3 small clay cups. He didn't prostrate himself or beg for mercy. His prayer was a gentle yet probing question. Every wrong has a source, every debt has an owner. The one who commits the act bears the consequence. Why torment those who are unrelated? The calm surface of the pond suddenly began to bubble. A crow swooped down from above, snatched the rooster's head, and flew straight into the middle of the reed bed. Old Man Thieu stood silently. He knew this spirit would not be easily placated. Its resentment had festered for too long, as deep as the pond itself and as dark as the mud beneath. That night, the crows' cawing was incessant, and within their cries, people heard the mournful, chilling wails of a woman. That night, Bầu Village was plunged into darkness, the flickering oil lamps in houses slowly fading out. Tam, old woman Tam's daughter, trembled as she hurried across the small dirt path to Old Man Thieu's house. Ever since her mother had collapsed in the village square, her condition had worsened. She wouldn't eat or drink, simply lay in bed, her breathing ragged, her eyes constantly rolled back. Old Man Thieu was sitting at a small wooden table, meticulously arranging pebble chess pieces, when Tam rushed in. He wasn't surprised, merely pushed a chair towards her. "Uncle Thieu, my mother. She's acting so strangely," Tam stammered, her face pale with fear, her breath coming in gasps. She recounted that strange sounds had begun in their house the previous evening. They weren't the sounds of scurrying rats or wind whistling through cracks, but a scratching, scuttling noise against the mud wall right by where her mother was lying. "And what about the smell?" Old Man Thieu asked. "Yes. A really strong, putrid, muddy smell, like dead animals rotting underwater. I've closed all the doors and windows, but the smell just keeps getting into the house." Old Man Thieu stood up abruptly, throwing a traditional ba shirt over his shoulders. He picked up his gnarled wooden staff and a small cloth bag filled with white sand. As they stepped out, A bone-chilling wind from the pond lashed at Tam's face, making her shiver and huddle close to Old Man Thieu. His limping footsteps made a rhythmic, dry sound on the ground in the profound silence of the night. Entering Old Woman Tam's house, a sense of coldness made Tam shudder. On the bed, Old Woman Tam lay still, her hands continuously clawing at the wooden bed frame, her fingernails bloody and caked with gray-black mud. Old Man Thieu approached, gently lifting her eyelids. Her entire eyeball was a milky white, no dark pupil visible. "Tam, who do you see?" Old Man Thieu asked softly, yet with immense power. Old Woman Tam suddenly sat bolt upright. Her movements were swift and jerky, like a puppet pulled by strings. She turned her head to look at Old Man Thieu, and the voice that came out was not hers, but that of a young woman, raw and desperate like water trickling in a dark cave. "It's so cold. Why won't anyone pull me up?" Tam screamed in fear, falling to the ground and covering her ears. Old Man Thieu remained unmoved. He took a handful of white sand from his bag and scattered it in a circle around Old Woman Tam's bed. "The departed should go to where they belong. This Bầu Village owes you nothing more." Old Woman Tam suddenly burst into raucous laughter, piercing and full of resentment. She pointed to the window, where darkness loomed. "Owes nothing? He stripped me. He drowned me in deep mud in front of everyone. And you say it owes nothing." As soon as she finished speaking, all the lamps in the house suddenly went out. A cold gust of wind from nowhere swept through, tearing at the paper door panels. In the darkness, Tam saw a thin, black shadow standing leaning against the mud wall, water dripping steadily from its entire body onto the wooden floor. Old Man Thieu raised his gnarled wooden staff, and a faint light emanated from its tip, causing the black shadow to recoil and vanish into thin air. Old Woman Tam slumped back onto the bed, her breathing gradually returning to normal, but her face was still deathly pale. Old Man Thieu relit the oil lamp and sighed. He realized that this spirit was not some distant demon, but a person from this very village. A person who had been cruelly killed by the village's own harsh customs decades ago. That vengeful spirit had now returned, and Old Woman Tam was just the first to suffer its wrath. "Uncle Thieu, who was that?" Tam asked, her voice faltering. Old Man Thieu looked out towards Bầu Pond, where the reeds swayed in the dark. "An old acquaintance. An acquaintance this Bầu Village has deliberately tried to forget for many years." Old Man Thieu warned Tam not to erase the sand circle around her mother's bed. He knew that tonight was only the first visit, and it would not stop until the blood debt was fully paid. As evening fell, Bầu Village slowly dimmed behind the distant mountains, the sky a deep, bruised purple. Old Man Thieu stood by his house, his eyes fixed on the reed bed. He called Engia and two other strong, brave young men from the village to accompany him on an important journey. Engia carried a sharp machete and a coil of rope. His face couldn't hide his anxiety, but he nodded in agreement. The three men began to walk into the reed forest. The deeper they went, the more solemn the atmosphere became. The reeds, taller than a person, had leaves as sharp as blades that seemed to cut at their skin. The ground became muddy, their footsteps making an uncomfortable squelching sound. Old Man Thieu walked in front, his limping feet strangely firm on the ground. His gnarled wooden staff tapped rhythmically into the mud. After nearly an hour of navigating through the dense bushes, they reached a small clearing nestled deep within the reed forest. In the center of this clearing was a sunken, mound-like grave, with no gravestone or even an incense stick. Strangely, no long grass grew around this grave, only a layer of dry, ashen-black earth, a stark contrast to the lush green reeds surrounding it. "Uncle Thieu, why is there a grave here in the middle of the reed forest?" Engia asked, his voice trembling as he felt the cold emanating from the earth. Old Man Thieu didn't answer immediately. He bent down, picked up a handful of soil, and sighed softly. "This isn't an ordinary grave. This is a spirit-binding burial site. The person buried here has their chi flow nailed down in all four limbs, preventing their soul from escaping to seek revenge." Engia's face drained of color at the thought. He stared intently at the sunken mound, a chilling scene forming in his mind. Old Man Thieu asked Engia to gently dig away the top layer of earth at the head of the grave with his shovel. When the earth was cleared, they found a rotten wooden tablet, on which faded red characters were carved. Old Man Thieu explained that it was the consequence of a harsh custom from hundreds of years ago in Bầu Village. When a woman was deemed to bring bad luck or had violated the village's great taboos, she would be thrown into the pond or buried alive in such a remote place, her soul imprisoned forever. This nameless grave was proof of the cruelty of the backward beliefs that had taken deep root in this land. The wind blew from the pond, causing the surrounding reeds to bend low, like shadowy figures bowing in lament. Engia suddenly felt as if something beneath the earth was grabbing at his feet. He looked down but saw nothing, only the black mud slowly rising to engulf his ankles. Don't look down, don't be afraid. The resentment here runs deep. It wants to find someone to take its place. Old Man Thieu's words were like a splash of cold water, piercing through Engia's panic. He used his gnarled wooden staff to draw a circle around where they stood. Strangely, as the circle closed, the sensation of being pulled from beneath Engia's feet completely vanished. The two men stood silently at the grave until darkness completely enveloped them. Old Man Thieu knew that finding this grave was only the first step in uncovering a dark chapter in Bầu Village's history, a truth that had been buried by the mud for far too long. The next morning, Bầu Village was shaken by grim news. Thieu, the eldest son of Old Man Tran from the village's most prestigious and ancient family, had suffered a tragic accident while repairing his roof. He had fallen headfirst to the ground, and his neck, usually strong, had struck the sharp edge of an old stone mortar, killing him instantly. Upon hearing the news, Old Man Thieu immediately went to the Tran family home, where the grand, yin-yang tiled roof was overshadowed by an atmosphere of grief. Old Man Tran sat on a wooden platform, his aged, wrinkled face filled with shock and bewilderment. This was the third man in the Tran family to suffer a misfortune in less than a month. One of Thieu's cousins had been found dead in a hole, and another nephew had gone missing while in the forest. "Uncle Thieu, has my family committed some offense? Why does calamity keep befalling the men in our clan?" Old Man Tran asked, his voice trembling, devoid of his usual commanding presence. Old Man Thieu observed the Tran family's ancestral altar, where the ancestral tablets were neatly arranged. He noticed that the central incense burner on the altar had a long crack running from its base to its rim. The ash inside was gray, like the burnt remnants of hair and scales. "Your Tran family owes a blood debt, a debt left by your ancestors that has not yet been fully paid." He spoke plainly, his eyes piercing Old Man Tran. Old Man Tran flinched, his thin hands gripping the wooden platform as if to support himself. His eyes flickered with a fearful, evasive look. Old Man Thieu began to unravel the events. All the accidents in the Tran family shared a commonality. The victims all suffered injuries to their necks, similar to the marks found on Leo's body. This indicated that the Avenger was targeting the throats of the men in the village, especially those of the Tran family. Connecting the memories of the nameless grave in the reed forest and Old Woman Tam's ramblings, Old Man Thieu realized that the one sowing terror was the woman from the Tran family, Thieu, from 30 years ago. She was a beautiful girl, but falsely accused of having an affair with a stranger. Abandoned by her family and the villagers, she was ultimately thrown into Bầu Pond on a stormy night. Those who directly carried out that cruel sentence were all respected members of the Tran family. They believed that by binding Thieu's soul in the reed forest, the matter would be concluded. But they never imagined that the resentment and hatred of the wrongfully accused woman would transform her into a spiritual entity filled with vengeful energy, waiting for the opportune moment to reclaim the lives of each person. "Old man, if you don't reveal the truth and find a way to resolve this curse will not stop at young Thieu," Old Man Thieu warned. Old Man Tran bowed his head in silence, and in the quiet of the ancestral hall, a cracking sound suddenly echoed. The ancestral tablet of the Tran family's founder unexpectedly fell and shattered. A chilling cold air rose from the floor, causing the candles on the altar to flicker and die out. On a July night, the high-hanging moon was shrouded by thick, dull clouds, making its light appear dim, as if filtered through a veil. Old Man Thieu planned to set up an altar that night at the ancestor shrine and the old shrine near the edge of Bầu Pond. According to Old Man Thieu, this was the intersection between the positive and negative realms of the village, and also where Thieu's spirit often lingered. The villagers were ordered to stay inside, shut their doors and windows tight, and not light any lamps. Only Engia and 2 other brave young men were allowed to stay and assist Old Man Thieu. The ancestor shrine looked more eerie than usual that night. The trees around it didn't stir, despite the wind, and the crows cawing from the shrine's roof was constant and mournful. Old Man Thieu set up a makeshift altar in front of the shrine's entrance. On the altar, there was only a plate of salted chicken, a bowl of clear water, and a peach wood staff. He didn't scatter charms everywhere but sat silently in meditation, his eyes closed. Just as the clock struck midnight, a cold gust of wind from the pond rushed in, carrying a putrid, muddy smell. The candles Old Man Thieu had lit on the altar immediately extinguished, even though there was no strong wind. In the darkness, Angia and the others saw flickering black shadows appearing on the shrine's walls. They had no distinct shapes, just long, dark streaks darting quickly. A desolate, mournful cry began to echo from the reed bed, initially a soft weeping, then gradually escalating into a raging shriek of hatred. A figure of a woman, dressed in a tattered white dress, her hair soaking wet, rose from the pond's surface and glided through the air towards the shrine. Her face was deathly pale, without eyes or nose, just a wide-open mouth that ceaselessly emitted a terrifying sound. "Give me back my life. Give me back my life." That chilling wail didn't just echo in the room, it seemed to pierce straight into the minds of everyone present. The young men with Angia couldn't bear the pressure. They fell to the ground, clutching their heads and groaning. Old Man Thieu suddenly opened his eyes. He grabbed his peachwood staff and slammed it 3 times firmly onto the ground. "Vengeful spirit, stop here. Hatred cannot be resolved with the blood of the innocent," Old Man Thieu declared solemnly. The white shadow stopped right at the edge of the protective circle. A thin, bony hand with long, pale fingernails reached out to touch Old Man Thieu, but was repelled by a burst of light from the peachwood staff. The battle was not one of physical strength, but of spiritual will and magical power. Waves of dark, corrupt energy continuously crashed against the invisible barrier Old Man Thieu had created. The battle lasted until nearly dawn. The shadowy figures on the shrine walls gradually dissipated as the first rays of sunlight appeared on the horizon. The woman's white shadow slowly retreated towards the pond, her eyeless gaze fixed on Old Man Thieu with extreme resentment before she vanished. Old Man Thieu stumbled backward, his face pale with exhaustion. He knew that tonight he had only temporarily stopped the attack, but he had not yet resolved the 30 years of accumulated resentment. In Bầu Village, there lived a woman named Thieu. She was over 50 but lived alone in a small shack at the end of the village. What was peculiar was that she had been completely silent since Thieu's death 30 years ago. The villagers called her Thieu the Mute. She often collected dry firewood and wild vegetables around Bầu Pond, her face always smudged with ash, which earned her the nickname, the Ash-Faced Woman, among the village children. A few days after the battle at the ancestor shrine, Thieu suddenly began acting strangely. She stopped collecting firewood and instead stood at the edge of the village, staring intently at the Tran family men who passed by. One afternoon, as Old Man Thieu was walking past her shack, Thieu unexpectedly ran out and blocked his path. Her lips trembled as she stammered, making incomprehensible sounds, as if desperately trying to convey something extremely important. Old Man Thieu stopped, looking into her eyes, which were filled with fear and remorse. He noticed a faint, non-hostile negative energy around her. He led her back to her shack and poured her a bowl of warm ginger water to calm her down. After a long while, Thieu's hands stopped trembling. She picked up a piece of charcoal and wrote on the dirt floor. The strokes were crude but clear. Thieu died not because of sin. She died because of Old Man Tran's secret. Old Man Thieu closed his eyes, contemplating the words. Just then, Thieu suddenly looked up and spoke. Her voice was hoarse, rough, like dry wood snapping. After 30 years of silence, the first sound she uttered was a name. "Thieu, I'm sorry." Thieu began to recount her story, tears streaming down her face. 30 years ago, she had been Thieu's only close friend. She had witnessed how Old Man Tran, then a young man, had falsely accused Thieu of an illicit affair with a stranger in the area, all to seize the private property her father had left her. Thieu herself, out of fear of the Tran family's power and their threats to kill anyone who spoke out, had remained silent, even being forced to lie to the villagers to condemn Thieu. The truth was finally revealed. Thieu had committed no immoral acts. She was merely the victim of a ruthless scheme of usurpation. Thieu recalled that on the night Thieu was thrown into the pond, she had looked directly into Thieu's eyes, not with hatred, but with profound disappointment. That gaze had haunted Thieu for 30 years, driving her into self-imposed silence as a form of self-punishment. Thieu retrieved a tattered old cloth from under her bed. Inside, it contained a broken jade piece. This was the precious item Old Man Tran had been desperately searching for years ago, which Thieu had managed to hide and give to Thieu before being captured. This jade piece was the key to everything. It contained the spiritual essence of Thieu's family and was the very object her vengeful spirit was seeking to restore its power of retribution. Old Man Thieu took the jade piece. He felt a faint surge of warmth pass through his hand. He understood that he now held the key to this wrongful case. But her breaking her silence also meant she had shattered the protection of that silence, and Thieu's vengeful spirit would surely not let it pass. At that very moment, the crows on Heen's shack roof began to caw once more. Old Man Thieu knew another terrifying night was about to descend upon Bầu Village, which was now consumed by an unsettling silence. The reeds, which had always swayed restlessly, now stood rigidly still, like rows of spectral guards on the pond's surface. A white fog began to slowly emerge, not in patches, but as a single, eerie white expanse stretching from one bank to the other. That night, two poor villagers, Co and M, driven by hunger, cautiously launched their small boat onto the pond's edge to try and catch any remaining shrimp or fish. They dared not venture into deeper waters, only staying in the shallows. Co held the oar, while M held a low-lit lantern to scan the water's surface. Suddenly, the pond's calm surface violently erupted with foam. Large bubbles, the size of a fist, burst, releasing a strong, putrid, muddy odor. M rubbed his eyes. About 10 meters ahead, he saw a figure hovering silently in the deep water. It stood upright, clad in a tattered, old white traditional dress, torn fabric clinging to its gaunt body. M trembled, raising his lantern higher to see clearly. The flickering light from the lamp illuminated the figure, and a wave of terror choked him. He realized that the entity had no face at all. Where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was only a smooth, pale white surface, like a water-soaked piece of paper. "Uncle Co, look," M whispered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. Co looked in the direction M was pointing, and his limbs went numb. The oar slipped from his grasp, creating faint ripples on the water. The faceless ghost began to walk on the water's surface. Its feet didn't sink. It advanced towards their boat slowly but with chilling determination. As the two villagers were paralyzed with terror, the distinct sound of a peach wood staff striking the ground echoed from the direction of the pond. Old Man Thieu was standing there. No one knew when he had arrived. His face was stern, his hand holding a small bronze mirror engraved with ancient Bagua symbols. He knew that Thieu's spirit was gathering strength to target the villagers. M and Co closed their eyes as Old Man Thieu's voice rang out, firm and resolute, in the profound silence of the night. It was as if they had suddenly awakened. They quickly covered their eyes and lay flat in the bottom of the boat. Old Man Thieu raised the bronze mirror towards the faceless ghost. The faint moonlight hit the mirror's surface, reflecting a stream of blue light onto the entity on the water. The ghostly figure suddenly froze, its entire body trembling violently. Incessant, mournful wails erupted from nowhere, echoing across the pond. The water began to churn fiercely, as if an invisible pressure was creating a swirling vortex beneath the surface. Old Man Thieu bit his finger, letting a drop of blood fall onto the center of the mirror, then chanted an ancient incantation. The bronze mirror emitted a circle of light that enveloped the area around the water's edge, forming a solid protective barrier. The faceless ghost could not advance further. It turned, its long, wet hair trailing on the water, then vanished into the dense reeds. The white fog dissipated, leaving the two terrified villagers in their solitary boat. Old Man Thieu exhaled, his hand still slightly trembling from expending so much spiritual energy. He knew that this was just the beginning of a brutal confrontation, for that entity was far beyond an ordinary vengeful spirit. It had become a malevolent entity capable of controlling the very space around Bầu Pond. Returning to his small house after the grim confrontation at the pond, Old Man Thieu sat silently by the warm hearth. He pulled up the left leg of his trousers, revealing a wooden leg, crudely carved from peach wood, replacing his limb from the knee down. The old scar on his thigh was still red and inflamed. Whenever the weather changed or he encountered strong negative energy, it would ache as if thousands of needles were piercing his flesh. He recalled an event 20 years ago when he was a strong man, traveling through the northern mountains to seek enlightenment. That year, he confronted a forest demon in a remote village. It was a horrific battle between life and death. The demon used dark magic to create a yin-yang entrapment beneath the earth. When he stepped in, his leg was gnawed at by malevolent spirits. To escape death and destroy the demon, he had to use a knife to sever part of his own leg, thereby breaking the spell. That was the price for interfering with the laws of creation. From then on, he became Thieu the Lame. His wooden leg was not just a physical defect, but a constant reminder of the spiritual brutality he was now venturing into. In the darkness, he pondered the entity in Bầu Village. He noticed a terrifying similarity between Thieu's vengeful spirit and the forest demon of years past. Both carried an unresolvable hatred. But Thieu's spirit was even more terrifying because of its blood ties to the Tran family and the dark secrets of this village. I lost a leg to save a village. Will this time the price be my life? He asked himself, the flickering firelight illuminating the deep wrinkles on his forehead. He understood that he couldn't fight this battle alone. The power lurking beneath Bầu Pond was growing stronger every day, fueled by the villagers' fear and the concealment of the truth by the guilty. His wooden leg suddenly emitted a strange coldness. He looked down and saw a thin, white layer of frost covering it. This signaled that the entity was trying to infiltrate his mind, probing for the weakest points in his soul. Old Man Thieu quickly took out a small jar and scattered a ring of sticky rice around himself to prevent the intrusion of malevolent energy. He didn't sleep that entire night. He sat there, holding his peachwood staff, quietly chanting scriptures to keep his mind clear. He understood that this enemy had powerful illusionary abilities. If he wavered even for a moment, his soul would be dragged down into the muddy depths of the pond, where thousands of wronged souls awaited to take their revenge. The next morning, Bầu Village saw no sunlight. A thick, dense fog enveloped the entire village, from its small dirt roads to the deepest nooks of the forest. This fog was unlike ordinary mist. It was an eerie gray color and carried the putrid smell of the marshland. The villagers of Bầu realized something was terribly wrong when they couldn't see their neighbors' houses, even those just a few steps away. 3 days passed, and the fog showed no sign of dissipating, bringing all village activities to a halt. Those who tried to leave the village for help would return to their starting point after hours of walking, or worse, simply vanish without a trace. The entire area around the village seemed to be separated from the outside world by an invisible wall. Within the fog, villagers began to see terrifying visions. Some saw Leo standing by the well, beckoning to them. Others saw Thieu repairing his roof, his neck unnaturally bent. Whispers and mournful cries filled the air. This was the maze of illusions that Thieu's vengeful spirit had cast to trap the souls of the entire village. Old Man Thieu knew he had to act immediately. He took out a stack of yellow talismans, dipped a rooster feather into black rooster blood, and drew protective symbols. He went from house to house, pasting a talisman on each main door and warning the villagers never to step outside or answer any calls from loved ones. "Uncle Thieu, when will the fog clear? I'm so scared," Tam said, clutching Old Man Thieu's hand when he arrived at her house. Her face was gaunt, her eyes dark-circled from lack of sleep. "Don't be afraid. Keep your mind calm. What you see are just illusions. Don't listen, don't look, just stay inside," Old Man Thieu reassured Tam before continuing on his way. As he approached Old Man Tran's house, the fog suddenly thickened. A blurred figure appeared before Old Man Thieu. It was a woman. He stopped, recognizing this as Thieu's form when she was alive before she was wronged. "Old Man Thieu, don't stop me. They killed me, they must pay," Thieu's voice echoed, gentle yet filled with unbearable sorrow. "Thieu, every wrong has a source, every debt has an owner. Killing the innocent will never bring you peace. Let me help you find justice." Thieu's figure suddenly transformed, her beautiful face twisted into a terrifying, pale, eyeless visage. She shrieked, then vanished into the fog. Old Man Thieu quickly pasted the last talisman on the Tran family's gate. He knew that this maze of illusions was just a prelude to a greater event that the entity would unleash tonight. On the 4th night of the thick fog, as Bầu Village plunged into utter panic, a strange sound began to echo, the haunting melody of a zither. It wasn't the usual crisp, vibrant sound, but carried a mournful, oppressive tone. Each note sounded like the stifled sob of a dying person. This sound seeped through cracks in doors, permeating every weary sleep. The zither's melody possessed a bizarre, alluring power. Men with impure hearts, those who had participated in Thieu's wrongful accusation years ago, or those consumed by greed, suddenly fell into a trance-like state. They rose, their eyes vacant, lifeless. Like sleepwalkers, they stepped out of their homes, drawn by the zither's call towards Bầu Pond. Old Man Tran was no exception. He got out of bed, his thin hands flailing in the air as if trying to grasp something. He walked past his sleeping, exhausted wife and out the door. The zither's melody grew increasingly urgent, as if compelling the guilty to hasten to their judgment. Old Man Thieu, who had been meditating in his house, suddenly sprang up. He heard the zither and immediately understood it was a powerful soul-summoning spell. He took out a small bronze bell, its surface engraved with ancient protective incantations. He stepped outside, and the bronze bell chimed with each shake of his hand, producing a clear, resonant sound that countered the eerie zither music. Awaken! Do not follow the sound of the zither, Old Man Thieu chanted, walking and shaking the bell, his voice echoing like thunder through the dense fog. At the pond's edge, a group of village men stood near the water. The zither music emanated from the middle of the reed bed, where a white shadow sat on a rotten boat, its fingerless hands plucking the strings of an illusory zither. The men began to step into the water. The muddy water reached their knees, but they seemed oblivious. Old Man Thieu appeared just in time. He threw a handful of rock salt into the air, then vigorously shook his bronze bell. A deafening clang pierced the air, interrupting the zither's melody. The entranced men suddenly jolted awake. When they found themselves standing in the cold pond water, they shrieked in terror and scrambled back to shore. The white shadow on the rotten boat suddenly stood up, its zither music transforming into a piercing shriek. The entire bow pond seemed to ripple with illusory currents, creating faint blue sparks. The rotten boat was shattered by an unseen force. The white shadow plunged deep into the water and vanished. The fog began to show signs of dissipating after Old Man Thieu's bell chimed. Suddenly, Old Man Thieu felt a sharp pain in his chest. Using the bronze bell to break the soul-summoning spell had heavily depleted his spiritual energy. He looked at Old Man Tran, who was shivering with fear, sprawled on the pond bank. Old Man Thieu knew that the secret of Thieu's death could no longer be hidden. That vengeful spirit would resort to its final measure to end everything. Bầu Village endured another sleepless night. But this time, the fear was tinged with the belated awakening of tormented consciences. The zither music had ceased, but its mournful echoes still haunted everyone's minds, a reminder of past sins. Bầu Village, after the harrowing night at the pond, seemed to fall into a collective daze. The fog thinned slightly, yet the atmosphere remained heavy with gloom. Old Man Thieu sat silently in Heen's shack. His hand lightly touched the jade piece Heen had given him. This jade, originally a clear emerald green, now showed faint red threads inside, like seeping blood vessels. Heen sat opposite him, her face in the oil lamp's light looking aged and strangely haggard. She trembled as she gestured to Old Man Thieu to go to the back garden of Old Man Tran's house. It was an abandoned plot, overgrown with tall grass, but strangely, the banana trees there were riddled with holes, their leaves blackened as if scorched by fire. Old Man Thieu stood up, his limping footsteps tapping on the dry earth. He felt a powerful, malevolent energy emanating from the stately ancestral home nearby. As he entered the Tran family's backyard, he discovered 4 wooden stakes driven deep into the ground at the 4 cardinal directions around the base of an ancient tree. Each stake was wrapped with 5 colored threads, but they were all completely rotted. He used his peach wood staff to clear away the dry leaves, revealing dried, dark bloodstains on the ground. This was the spirit-binding spell Old Man Tran had secretly performed for 30 years to imprison Thieu, preventing her from returning to demand retribution. Just then, a thin figure appeared on the porch. It was Old Man Tran. His face no longer bore its previous dignified facade, but was instead filled with malevolence, his eyes bloodshot, a blood-stained iron knife in his hand. "To the lame, you know too much. You should have left this village a long time ago." Old Man Tran's voice was hoarse, laced with a menacing threat. Old Man Thieu showed no fear. He raised the jade piece high. "Blood must pay for blood. You used dark magic to steal this jade from Thieu's father, then killed her to silence her. Did you think binding her soul would keep her quiet forever?" Old Man Tran laughed loudly, his cackling echoing through the garden. He admitted that years ago, he himself had tricked the villagers into believing Thieu was having an affair to create an excuse to throw her into the pond. This jade piece was an ancestral treasure that brought prosperity to its owner's family, and he would stop at nothing to possess it. Leo, too, all because of that wretched woman. Today, I'll drag you down there with them. With that, Old Man Tran lunged forward with his knife, but before he could touch Old Man Thieu, a blast of cold wind erupted from the ground, throwing him backward. From the rotted wooden stakes, plumes of black smoke began to rise, coiling tightly around Old Man Tran's legs, as if the dark magic was starting to turn against him. Old Man Thieu realized that the truth, once revealed, had finally freed Thieu's spirit from its final shackles, allowing her to carry out her bloody revenge. That night was the darkest of the month, with not a single star visible. Everything was pitch black, punctuated only by the whistling wind through the reeds and the mournful wails of thousands of spirits. Old Man Thieu knew this was the decisive moment. He went alone to Bầu Pond, where the water churned with furious eddies. Old Man Tran, after being struck down by dark energy in his garden, had vanished. Villagers reported seeing him running frantically towards the pond, as if being dragged by something. When Old Man Thieu reached the water's edge, he saw Old Man Tran standing in the muddy shallows, his hands flailing in the air, his mouth ceaselessly muttering meaningless pleas. Around him, dozens of faceless black shadows rose from the water. Old Man Thieu raised his peachwood staff, intending to use his spiritual power to stop the spirits from wreaking havoc and prevent the vengeful energy from spreading further. But just as he began to chant, a sharp bolt of lightning struck down from the sky right in front of him. The ground shook. His peachwood staff, his strongest magical artifact, unexpectedly cracked and broke in half. A chilling sensation enveloped Old Man Thieu. He understood that Old Man Tran's cruelty had fueled Thieu's vengeful spirit with power beyond Old Man Thieu's control. Old Man Thieu, don't save him, he must come down with me. Thieu's voice echoed through the air, her tone chillingly commanding, as if tearing through life itself. Her white shadow appeared right at the pond's edge, her long hair flowing into the black mud. She no longer had her human form but was a spiritual entity filled with deep resentment, her entire body emanating a faint purple glow. Old Man Tran screamed, then was violently dragged down into the water by an unseen force. He desperately tried to cling to the reed roots, but they coiled around his neck like ropes. Old Man Thieu quickly took out the last handful of salt from his bag and scattered a protective circle around himself, but the circle was quickly washed away by the churning water. In that moment of life or death, Old Man Thieu saw faint, swirling lights rising from skeletal remains at the bottom of the pond. These were the souls of previous victims, imprisoned by Thieu's vengeful energy. He realized that if he couldn't free Thieu's ashes, the entire Bầu Village would be swallowed by a sea of blood that very night. Old Man Tran was dragged further and further away, his desperate cries fading into the distance. Old Man Thieu stood silently in the darkness, holding the broken pieces of his staff. He understood that he had no other recourse. To save Bầu Village, he had to perform the most desperate act: plunge himself into the deep pond to find the remaining humanity within the wrongfully accused woman. Without a moment's hesitation, Old Man Thieu hurled himself into the murky black waters of Bầu Pond. A bone-chilling cold pierced him to the bone, enveloping his body. The pond bottom was not clear as it appeared from the shore, but thick with mud and tangled seaweed, like grasping human arms. He struggled to open his eyes, trying to orient himself in the gloomy darkness beneath the water. The deeper he sank, the more horrifying sights Old Man Thieu witnessed. The bottom of the pond was not sand or rock, but thick, dense mud filled with countless white skeletal fragments. These skeletons belonged to various eras, perhaps people swallowed by the marshland over hundreds of years. A powerful pressure squeezed his chest, making him gasp for air. There, he saw a tall, gaunt figure huddled among ancient bamboo stakes driven deep into the pond bed. It was Thieu's original form. She was clutching a small, rotten cloth bundle containing her ashes and the other half of the jade piece. Her spirit, at this moment, was no longer ferocious as it had been on the surface, but appeared incredibly weak and pained. Old Man Thieu swam closer. He didn't use spiritual power to suppress her, but gently touched Thieu's shoulder. A wave of sorrowful memories flooded his mind. He saw Thieu being bound, the villagers' cruel accusations hurled at her face, and finally, the suffocating sensation as she was drowned. He felt her profound loneliness, lying there for 30 years. "Thieu, I have come to bring you home. The truth has been revealed. Bầu Village owes you an apology." Old Man Thieu conveyed his thoughts through telepathy. Thieu's white shadow looked up at him, and her eyeless sockets wept black tears. She released the cloth bundle, pressing it into Old Man Thieu's hands. As his hand touched the bundle, the skeletons around them began to stir, as if trying to hold him back, not wanting him to take this secret away. Thousands of skeletal hands reached out from the mud, grasping his legs. He thrashed in despair as the air in his lungs ran out. Just then, the jade piece in his pocket shone brightly, creating a circle of light that repelled the darkness and the malevolent spirits. Old Man Thieu used all his remaining strength to push himself violently towards the surface. As his head broke through the pond's surface, he gasped for a deep breath, his lungs feeling as if they would explode from the sudden rush of air. On the shore, Tam and Engia stood waiting with brightly lit lanterns. Old Man Thieu raised the rotten cloth bundle. His whole body trembled with cold and exhaustion, but his eyes shone with a powerful belief. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the thick fog, Bầu Village seemed to awaken from a nightmare. Old Man Thieu asked the villagers to gather at the communal hall. On the high platform, he carefully arranged Thieu's ashes and the now complete jade piece. All the villagers stood silently. The disappearance of Old Man Tran and the deaths of the previous young men had made them realize the horror of their indifference and cruelty. Old Man Thieu began to recount the entire truth, from Old Man Tran's conspiracy to the injustice Thieu had suffered. His voice resonated clearly, sinking deep into everyone's hearts. Heen stepped forward and knelt before the ash bundle, beginning to sob uncontrollably. The elders who had participated in Thieu's trial years ago also bowed their heads in shame. The younger generation was stunned by the dark truth of their ancestors. We allowed hatred and greed to fester. This Bầu Pond has no ghost, the real ghost lies within each of us. Old Man Thieu said, then asked the villagers to collectively build a proper grave for Thieu right next to the ancestor shrine. The villagers immediately set to work. Some carried bricks, others lime, working in silence and reverence. When the grave was completed, a strange phenomenon occurred. The black crows, which had covered the rooftops, suddenly soared into the sky. The thick gray fog that had lingered for so long completely dissipated. Old Man Thieu stood by Thieu's grave. He placed the jade piece next to the incense burner. He knew that from now on, Thieu's spirit would be at peace. She would become the guardian deity of this village. From that day, the villagers of Bầu lived in greater harmony. Backward customs were gradually abolished. They understood that only truth and compassion could break curses. However, Old Man Tran's disappearance remained a big question mark. Old Man Thieu looked out at Bầu Pond, its water now calm and gentle. He smiled, a rare smile on his stern face. His task was now almost complete, but he knew that his true journey would take him to many more places. And perhaps in this world, there were still too many unresolved injustices. Dawn had just broken, but the air in Bầu Village still carried the echoes of a tumultuous night. Old Man Thieu, without resting, stood before the communal hall, his eyes still dark-circled, but his spirit incredibly resolute. He called Engia and the strong young men, asking them to prepare a large quantity of white rice and rock salt. Old Man Thieu meticulously instructed the villagers on how to scatter the rice and salt according to a specific pattern. He used his half-cracked peach wood staff to draw connecting lines on the ground from the village gate all the way to the edge of Bầu Pond. This was a large-scale cleansing ritual he had planned for a long time. He knew that 30 years of accumulated vengeful energy could not simply vanish with a few prayers, but required a powerful intervention on the land and water of this region. "Uncle Thieu, where do we start?" Engia asked, his hands trembling as he carried the heavy bag of salt. "Start from the boundary between the village land and the marshland and scatter it evenly. Don't leave any gaps. Salt to ward off evil. Rice to soothe wandering souls. Everyone must work with absolute sincerity, no foul language." All the men in the village began to work. They divided into several small groups, walking slowly along the pond bank. Handfuls of rice and salt were scattered, forming a shimmering white path under the morning sun. When the grains of salt touched the murky water of the pond, a strange phenomenon occurred. The pond began to bubble with white foam. Plumes of gray gas rose from the muddy depths, then dissolved into nothingness as they met the sunlight. The ground beneath the villagers' feet suddenly trembled slightly. Deep rumbling sounds emanated from the pond's depths, as if a monster was writhing in torment somewhere below. The reeds, which had stood still for so long, suddenly bent down, creating a clear path leading directly into the heart of the marshland. Old Man Thieu stood at the center, shaking his bronze bell vigorously. Its clear chimes echoed, penetrating the thin remaining fog. Old Man Thieu began to recite a spiritual chant. His voice was deep and resonant, filling the entire waterland. With each word of the chant, faint, luminous orbs began to rise from the pond's surface. These were the long-imprisoned souls, guided by the ritual and the chant to find their path to liberation. "Look, it's Leo!" a villager exclaimed when he saw a gentle blue light gently drifting past. Don't call anyone's name. Let them pass peacefully. Old Man Thieu reminded them in a stern voice. The atmosphere around Bầu Village gradually lightened. The putrid, muddy smell vanished, replaced by the scent of grass, plants, and moist earth after a rain. The ritual had worked, purifying all the defilement that had seeped deep into this land. The villagers watched the souls depart, their hearts filled with an indescribable, bittersweet emotion relief and lightness, yet also a pang of sorrow for the departed. When the last grains of rice and salt were scattered, Bầu Pond returned to its initial silence. But this time, it was a true, profound peace. While Bầu Village was undergoing the cleansing ritual, Old Man Tran had completely lost his mind. After being pulled into the water and luckily clinging to a large cluster of reeds, he had managed to crawl onto a small patch of land in the middle of the pond. However, the torment of the mind was far more terrifying than death. In his delirium, he imagined thousands of pale white hands reaching out from the water, tugging at his clothes and skin. "Let me go, I am the village head, you have no right to do this." Old Man Tran screamed, his eyes rolled back and completely white. He could no longer distinguish between reality and illusion. A gust of wind through the reeds transformed into Thieu's mournful laughter. The birds chirping sounded like the cries for vengeance of the past victims. He staggered to his feet, running madly through the reed bed. The sharp reeds tore at his clothes and skin. His feet trampled on broken branches and sharp snail shells, yet he felt no pain. Fear had completely numbed all his senses. Old Man Tran found himself standing before a grand ancestral house, but as he stepped inside, he realized it was the Tran family's ancestral hall, with blood-stained ancestral tablets. Faceless ghosts appeared, encircling him. They didn't attack, just stood there, staring with empty eye sockets. The silence of the wronged spirits was the most terrifying punishment. Old Man Tran fell to his knees, repeatedly banging his head against the muddy ground. He began to confess his sins, from cheating on public contributions to framing Thieu to seize the jade piece. "I was wrong, Thieu. Forgive me. I will return everything." His cries slowly faded into the vastness of the reed bed. A thick black smoke rose from beneath his feet, wrapped tightly around him, and pulled him deep down into a mud pit. This was the deepest part of Bầu Pond, a place where no light, not even sunlight, could ever reach. The next morning, when the villagers searched, they couldn't find Old Man Tran's body. The only remaining trace was a torn traditional outfit, clinging precariously to an old banyan branch near the water's edge, at the same spot where Leo had been found. The shirt was stained with black mud that never dried and carried a distinct, putrid smell characteristic of entities completely consumed by malevolent energy. Everyone understood that Old Man Tran had received his ultimate retribution. He had not died quickly, but his soul was eternally imprisoned in the darkness of Bầu Pond, atoning for his sins. The disappearance of the village head, a figure of power, was a stark warning to anyone who intended to use deceit and cruelty for personal gain. From then on, Bầu Village no longer had a Tran family head, but peace slowly returned to every home. A week after the ritual was completed, Bầu Village seemed to have put on a new coat. Bright yellow sunlight streamed down onto the scattered sand, warming the thatched houses that had long been damp with fog. The atmosphere no longer felt gloomy. The cheerful chirping of birds returned to the ancient banyan trees. Children in the village ran and played freely on the red dirt roads, no longer fearing the lingering shadows. Old Man Thieu went to the ancestor shrine. It had now been cleaned and tidied by the villagers. Next to the shrine, Thieu's newly built grave had incense constantly burning. Old Man Thieu prepared a final offering to thank the spirits and bid farewell to the departed. This time, the offerings were simple: a plate of fresh fruit, a plate of white sticky rice, and fragrant tea. "Uncle Thieu, is it really over now?" Tam asked, holding a bunch of white flowers she had picked from the garden. Her cheeks were rosy again, no longer pale and gaunt as in the previous days. "Whether it's over or not depends on the living. The resentment has dissipated, but the lesson must always be remembered. Bầu Village will be different from now on." He lit 10 incense sticks and placed them in the incense burner on Thieu's grave. He stood silently for a long time, softly murmuring blessings for the soul of the unfortunate woman. When the incense burned halfway down, a gentle breeze swept through, carrying the scent of ripe rice and the gentle earth. In the sky, a pair of swallows circled the shrine, then flew off towards Bầu Pond. The water was now a clear blue, reflecting the white clouds. The villagers flocked to the shrine, each carrying a small offering. They lit incense and prayed. The recent events had bound everyone together more than ever, and the old conflicts and enmities between families seemed to have also vanished after the horrific spiritual trial. They understood that without unity and compassion, Bầu Village might have been destroyed by its own sins. Hien was also present. Her face was no longer smudged with ash. Her expression became radiant as she saw her friend finally resting peacefully in a proper grave. She took Tam's hand, her aged eyes sparkling with joy. Her 30 years of silence had ended, and from now on, she could live out her remaining days in tranquility. Old Man Thieu watched the villagers gathered. He felt his spirit lighten in a strange way. The scars on his lame leg no longer ached when the wind blew. He knew that he had completed his mission in this land. The afternoon sun shone on the pond's surface, creating a shimmering golden path. Bầu Village had truly been reborn from the ashes of resentment and darkness. The next morning, while the villagers were still deep in peaceful sleep, Old Man Thieu quietly packed his belongings into his small cloth bag. He didn't want a noisy farewell. He held his peach wood staff, which he had reinforced with a red cloth strip. He looked back at the small house he had called home for over 10 years. His limping footsteps were silent on the dirt road, which still had remnants of white salt from the previous day's ritual. As he reached the village gate, he paused for a moment, looking back at Bầu Pond one last time. There, the water was calm and still, like a giant mirror, concealing within its depths countless secrets of time. Old Man Thieu understood that anywhere on this earth, there were still injustices that needed to be resolved, souls that needed to be guided. He was not a sorcerer, nor a hero. He was merely a guardian at the gate, balancing the yin and yang realms. "Uncle Thieu, are you really leaving?" Engia ran up from behind, his breath ragged. He had anticipated Old Man Thieu's departure. "I have done what needed to be done. This place is peaceful now. It doesn't need an old, lame man like me. You stay and help the villagers look after the ancestor shrine and never let greed blind you, like those who came before." Engia bowed, his heart filled with respect and regret. He offered Old Man Thieu a small bundle of dried provisions and some loose change the villagers had collected. But Old Man Thieu only accepted the dried provisions. He patted Engia's shoulder, then turned and walked towards the horizon. As the sun began to rise, Old Man Thieu's shadow stretched long on the deserted road. His limp made his gait uneven, but each step was incredibly firm and steady. He walked past lush green rice fields, past the old bamboo hedges rustling in the early morning breeze. His admonitions about honesty and compassion still echoed in the minds of the Bầu villagers, serving as a guiding principle for their lives to come. From then on, Bầu Village became known as a peaceful and sacred land. People told each other stories of the woman in the white dress beneath the deep pond, who had become a guardian spirit, and of the lame man who had used his spiritual power and a sincere heart to save an entire village from disaster. The story of Old Man Thieu, the ghost catcher of Bầu Village, was thus passed down from generation to generation, not to instill fear, but to remind people of the law of karma and the power of truth. As his silhouette vanished behind the distant mountains, a cold breeze swept through Bầu Village, carrying the clear, lingering sound of the bronze bell. The pond still lay there, silent and benevolent. It embraced the painful memories that had been set free. True peace had returned, not just on the land, but deep within the souls of every villager there. The spiritual scars would remain, but they no longer ached. Instead, they were proof of the community's growth and awakening after the storms of injustice.